one of our proud partners is the University of London, and we're so pleased that we can partner with them today to bring you this event. Now, tomorrow, so it's Tuesday, the 9th of June, marks the 150th anniversary of Charles Dickens's death. And we're thrilled to be hosting this virtual private view of childhood in Dickensian London, an exhibition at Sonnet House. The physical exhibition's at Sonnet House Library. Of course, we can't visit there, we can't be there at the moment, but the exhibition celebrates the life and work of Charles Dickens, exploring the impact of his writing, exploring the impact his writing had on the lives of children and the change it inspired in Victorian society. The items on display are drawn from the rich and extensive collections held at Sonnet House Library, which cares for more than 2 million books, 50 unique special collections, and over 1,600 archives. I'd like to introduce Rebecca Simpson, who's the Communications and Engagement Officer at Sonnet House Library, to tell us a bit more about the library and this exhibition, and then to introduce us to Leila Kassir and Tansy Barton, who are the curators of the exhibition. After the tour, which will last roughly 30 minutes, there'll be the Q&A, so do keep your questions ready. Okay, over to you, Rebecca.
Hi everyone, really lovely to have you here. I'm just going to share my screen, so just do bear with me 1 second. Okay, a warm welcome to Sonnet House Library, a virtual exhibition tour. Sonnet House Library cares for more than 2 million books, 50 unique special collections, and over 1,600 archives. It's one of the UK's largest academic libraries. Today we'll be giving you a tour of childhood in Dickensian London. In this exhibition, we celebrate the life and work of Charles Dickens, exploring the impact his writing had on the lives of children and the change it inspired in Victorian society. I'm Rebecca Simpson, I'm the exhibition designer, and I'll be giving you a brief introduction and behind the scenes before handing over to the curators, who will go through the themes and highlights in the exhibition. There are 4 main themes in the exhibition and over 80 items on display, focusing on social injustice through some of Dickens's well-known child characters. With 2020 marking the 150th anniversary of Charles Dickens's death, we wanted to celebrate his influence and take people on the journey through Victorian London from the 1830s until the turn of the 20th century. This quote from Great Expectations sums it up nicely. "In the little world in which children have their existence, whosoever brings them up, there is nothing so finely perceived and so finely felt as injustice." On display are some first edition copies of Dickens' most loved novels, examples of his journalism, some intricate drawings and sketches of Dickens and the characters he created. We were delighted to work with the Charles Dickens Museum to include some of Dickens' personal items, and with Charles Dickens' great-great-great-granddaughter, Lucinda Dickens Hawksley, who you can see here. We created a video called Dickens' London Legacy, which is available on our YouTube channel. We're also delighted to be joined by Gerard Versani, who plays the 12-year-old Charles Dickens in Armando Iannucci's recent film on David Copperfield. Here you can see both of them here. And here we are at the entrance to the library, which is a good place to mention a little bit about the design and bringing Dickens' legacy to life. The central image of the children is taken from one of the items on display, chosen because it's a great representation of the different experiences of Victorian children. The light and enticing colours were chosen to bring a contemporary feel and capture people's attention. And like the image is also influenced by the collections. Here you can see myself and Maria Castria, who planned and designed the exhibitions, in the entranceway to the exhibition on site. We think about the on-site and online visitor experience and work with conservators to look at the items we have and how we can best display them. This is a large map of poor law unions, and it's dated 1900. You can see the colours on the map influence the colour scheme of the design. Due to its size, it wasn't possible to display the original, so we printed it on vinyl to allow people to engage with it more closely. You can also see here, inside the exhibition, how we've enlarged some of the stunning illustrations to complement the written word. We work closely with the curators, who do the main research into our collections to decide on the final items to display. Here you can see Tansy Barton and Leila Kassir, the co-curators of this exhibition, who will now guide you through the themes, starting with Leila.
Okay, so we're going to begin with the section called Master Storyteller, which introduces the key strands that underpin the entire exhibition. The section features a mix of works by Dickens and items related to his life, alongside examples of the types of legislation that affected the lives of Victorian children and campaigning texts which aimed to improve their condition. As a 12-year-old, Dickens was working 10-hour days at Warren's blacking factory and lived alone in lodgings while his parents and younger siblings were in prison. These difficult experiences were only revealed 2 years after his death through John Forster's biography, The Life of Charles Dickens. His personal experience of childhood poverty, labour and inadequate education deeply influenced the development of child characters in his novels, whose experiences often provide vivid depictions of society's negligence. His own biography directly influenced the character and novel of David Copperfield. Included in the section are an obituary illustration of Dickens's Gad's Hill writing desk, two of his most famous child creations, David Copperfield and Oliver Twist, and the Poor Law Amendment Act, which fundamentally altered the provision of welfare in England. Two items on loan from the Dickens Museum feature: a silver teaspoon belonging to the Dickens family, which was probably pawned when money was short, and a bottle from Warren's blacking factory where the young Charles worked. To highlight Dickens's merging of life and art, I'm going to focus on two interlinked items: his novella, A Christmas Carol, and the report from a government commission on the condition and treatment of the children employed in mines and collieries in the UK. During the 1840s, Dickens wrote 5 Christmas stories, the first and most famous of which was A Christmas Carol, a story which depicts cruelty, poverty, but ultimately the redeeming power of kindness through the ghostly experiences of Ebenezer Scrooge one Christmas night. The first edition of A Christmas Carol is open to show John Leech's illustration of the children of ignorance and want that so terrify Scrooge. These children are presented to Scrooge by the ghost of Christmas presents and are depicted against a stark industrial background, reflecting all that was wrong with society. The themes of this 1843 story are still resonant today, although its genesis stemmed from a very particular social moment. Dickens read the report on child labour and was so horrified that he initially planned to publish a campaigning pamphlet in response. In correspondence with his friend Dr. Southwood Smith, Dickens made known his decision, but then he changed his mind, deciding instead that a piece of fiction illustrating the wrongs of society would have more power than a straight political tract. Dickens told Southwood Smith that his story would have the power of a sledgehammer blow. This was A Christmas Carol, which continues to be told and retold today. We also have on display a set of miniature copies of the 5 Christmas books, which are complete, including full illustrations. Miniature books are officially those which are smaller than 3 inches and were particularly in vogue during the 19th century. These Christmas books were published in 1904 by Henry Froude, who was the one-time publisher at the Oxford University Press, and who invented the use of fine paper to publish such small books. The report on child employment was overseen by Lord Ashley and was published in 1842. Its findings, which depicted the labour and sufferings of children, some as young as 5, appalled society. The full version of the report was extensive, but the copy we have on display is an edited, reader-friendly version, which nonetheless still explicitly presents the horrors of child labour as seen by the subtitle relating the horrible prostitution and murder of females and children. Most movingly, the report includes testimony from the children themselves, those whose underground work meant they knew nothing of the ascending or descending sun. The employment report contains powerful illustrations of underground work, many of which show women and children, often semi-clad, pulling carts of coal. Although they are uncredited, the originals are likely to be by Margaret Gillies, the artist of the formerly lost portrait of Dickens, recently housed and on display at the Dickens Museum. These illustrations were reused many times in publications such as this one, and also in magazine articles about the report, and vividly added to the impact of the findings. The Criminality and Redemption section features works which consider the treatment of street children and their perceived or actual proximity to crime. This section particularly focuses on middle-class society's response to these children, which tended to veer between fear and compassion. In 1824, Charles Dickens' father John was imprisoned in London's Marshalsea debtors' prison, where people were held for unpaid debt. John was accompanied by his wife and youngest children, while the young Charles lived in lodgings nearby. Amy, the title character of Little Dorrit, is born and raised in the Marshalsea, living there alongside her imprisoned father. Dickens knew from his own childhood that the actions of adults and the ensuing reactions of the state could affect children's lives. His works show the impact adult behaviour can have on children, either for good or ill. The plight of homeless and neglected children and the sometimes dangerous alternatives that were available to them are also considered. With Oliver Twist and the Artful Dodger, Dickens shows differing responses to membership of Fagin's alternative family, his gang of pickpocketing street children. Items on display in this section include his characters Pip, Oliver Twist, and the slightly less well-known street child from the Haunted Man Christmas book, alongside examples of journalism and fundraising tracts and broadsides from charities concerned with children's welfare. But it is with Jack Dawkins, more famously known as the Artful Dodger or just Dodger, that we turn to now. Although we have on display the book itself with its illustrations by George Cruikshank, we are showing you here another item which sits alongside it. Dickens' characters are so popular that they have been reimagined many times since their creation, both in books and on ephemera such as this postcard of Dodger, published by Raphael Tuck. The illustration is by Joseph Clayton Clark, who drew under the pseudonym Kid and illustrated many of Dickens' characters during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This bright and bold illustration shows Dodger very much as Oliver Twist and the reader first encounter him on the road to London, and presents him as a striking contrast to the pale, thin Oliver. Although the two boys are roughly the same age and Dodger is no more than 4'6" tall, his demeanour is decidedly ambiguous. He is described as equal parts boy, juvenile and gentleman. Dodger is wearing an adult's coat which trails to the ground, is smoking a pipe and has a face aged well beyond his young years. This confusing appearance is evidence of the life he's led, living on London streets in the company of adult criminals such as Fagin and Bill Sikes. His appearance also feeds into 19th century fears that if a child spent too long with adult criminals, they would inevitably lead an irredeemable life of crime. Many organisations work with these children to take them away from the streets, although some of their methods are shocking to us today. Dodger himself is finally caught thieving and is booked for a passage out, presumably to one of Britain's former colonies. Although most of the 19th century campaigning publications concerning street children understandably show them in conditions of despair, the second highlight from this section presents a slightly different perspective. Dorothy Tennant, also known as Lady Stanley, was a painter who specialised in depictions of children and families. In 1890, she illustrated the book we have on display called London Street Arabs. This book contains a series of her drawings of street children, reflecting an alternative to what she called the false and made-up images of tragic children. This was presumably a nod to campaigners such as Dr. Bernardo, who have been found guilty of such falsification. Instead, Tennant shows her street children playing, being reckless and happy-go-lucky. One of her images features as the main illustration for this exhibition, as it shows children in a variety of stances, including one who looks not dissimilar to Dodger. Despite this relative joy, Tennant does admit in her introduction that she too provided clothes for her models to wear. The book also represents an attitude which was common amongst the Victorian middle class and which can be troubling for us today, such as the use of street Arabs in the title. This phrase, which employs colonial stereotypes to create a sense of otherness around street children, appears often in 19th century texts.
From Criminality and Redemption, we move to Wanton Welfare. Charles Dickens' own childhood was marked by instability in his family's life. They moved several times, living in more than 10 addresses before he had finished his education at 15. The family's financial woes resulted in the 12-year-old Charles living apart from his family in lodging houses such as this one in Lant Street. The living conditions, health and welfare of the poor, and particularly of children, were great concerns to Dickens. He devoted much of his journalistic work to revealing the conditions in the slum housing and workhouses, highlighting problems of poor sanitation, and advocating for the care and health of children. He was an early champion of Great Ormond Street Hospital, established as the first specialist hospital for children in the UK in 1852. There was no overarching state welfare system in Dickens' lifetime, and he showed a precariousness of children's lives through child characters such as Oliver Twist, Little Nell, Paul Dombey, Jodie Cossenbury, and Jack Gorham, many of whom had birthdays selfish, weak, or absent. Also, many of the children's successes, many of the child characters were depicted as having parents depicted as selfish, weak, or absent. Dickens also showed many of these neglected children's successes despite the setback and hard conditions they endured. The housing of poor families in the slums of growing concern during this period extended to an increased interest in children's health and prevention of disease. Sanitation became a key issue that was addressed through campaigns, legislation aimed at improving standards of living, sewerage, and as a result, life expectancy. The question of who should care for neglected or orphan children and how should be cared for became crucial issues for social reformers in the 19th century. Alternatives to parental care were offered by institutions, including workhouses, orphanages, and foundling homes. Orphans included not only children who had lost two parents, but also children who had only lost their father, even though neither was still alive. This section includes several of Dickens' works, alongside items considered protection, welfare, and living conditions of children, both individually and collectively, in the face of threats to their well-being in Victorian London. The first item that I wanted to highlight from this section relates to care, disease, and sanitation. Sanitation became one of the most important causes Dickens campaigned for in later life, particularly through his own journals, Household Words and All the Year Round. But prior to founding these journals, Dickens published a series of 4 articles in the radical weekly newspaper, The Examiner, in 1849, including the Paradise at Tooting. They covered a tragedy that occurred at Mr. Druitt's establishment for poor children in Tooting. This school housed over 1,300 children from the poorest parishes of central London until an outbreak of cholera led to the deaths of at least 180 of the children in Druitt's care. From 1848, London was suffering under the 3rd worldwide cholera outbreak, the most devastating for the city, with over 14,000 deaths. The newly formed Board of Health issued advice on precautions against cholera, but had no jurisdiction over Tooting. Yet when news emerged of large numbers of children dying at the home, the board investigated and exposed the terrible conditions there. The Board of Health, the chair of the Board of Health was Henry Austen, Dickens' brother-in-law, and this was perhaps the first time he had dedicated himself to such an injustice as a journalist, but it would become a common theme of his work. Dickens' articles followed the course of the coroner's report and Druitt's trial for manslaughter. Dickens denounced Druitt in the harshest terms, as his supposed paradise was revealed as a place of neglect, abuse, and overcrowding, run for its proprietors' profits rather than the welfare of the children sent there. His anger was also directed at the poor law guardians, boards, and inspectors who continued to send children to the school and did not attempt to improve the conditions or act on evidence of mistreatment. The final article, The Verdict for Druitt, particularly laments the failure to try anyone but Druitt himself and the systematic failures that were not held to account. From Dickens' journalism to his fiction, this section also features an edition of Oliver Twist, open at George Cruikshank's illustration of Oliver asking for more. Oliver Twist has one of the best known depictions of the 19th century workhouse, with the cruel treatments suffered by Oliver and his fellow inmates. And possibly the book's most famous scene, Dickens dramatised the meanness of the workhouse diet, as young Oliver is fed nothing but gruel in meagre portions, leading to the famous line, "Please, sir, I want some more." The scene became archetypal of Victorian cruelty. The book is actually set under the system of the old poor law, but when writing and publishing the story in the late 1830s, Dickens must have been aware of the controversy in opposition to the new poor law, which put an emphasis on the role of the workhouse in poor relief. Alongside Oliver asking for more, we have the Book of the Bastilles, a volume that collected criticism and opposition to the new poor law, published just 6 years after the Act in 1836. In the chapter on Bastille food, a table from a letter by the Chartist leader and reformer, James Bontier O'Brien, reveals the diet for under 16s. It is not quite just gruel, but bread, gruel and cheese with meat, potatoes and soup twice a week. As O'Brien laments, no puddings, no milk, no beer, but the everlasting gruel and the everlasting cheese, morning, noon and night. Our final section is labour and learning. Charles Dickens experienced firsthand child labour firsthand, spending a year in the shadow of Hungerford Steps, covering and labelling pots of blacking paste at Warren's blacking factory to earn money to support his family. This traumatic period cast a shadow over his life and directly influenced the character of young David Copperfield, with his experience of being removed from school and set to work. This turbulent upbringing interrupted Dickens' own schooling, yet he believed in the essential value of education as a force for improvement. In his speeches and journalism, Dickens frequently highlighted the lack of access to education, particularly for the poor, and while in his novels, school systems and teaching methods were criticised and their inadequacies and savagery exposed. For many Victorian children, their first contact with the world outside their homes was the workplace or the school. For working class children, daily labour in factories, workshops, domestic service and on the streets was a reality of life, often providing essential income for their families. Many of the poorest children and orphans who ended up in workhouses were eventually employed as apprentices in trades or in factories and mills and mines. During Dickens' lifetime, public schools and other fee-paying schools provided education for the middle and upper classes. For the poorest children, it was through charity schools, the Church of England's national schools, rugged schools, or the compulsory workhouse or factory schools. Through campaigns and successive pieces of legislation in the 19th century, the education of all children gradually became more important and supplanted the economic importance of a child's labour. In 1870, the year of Dickens' death, the Elementary Education Act introduced compulsory education for children under 12 years of age for the first time. In this section are some of Dickens' most popular works depicting child labour and education, alongside items showing the growth of campaigns against child labour and for increased education for all children. Among the exhibits are a rare first edition part of Nicholas Nickleby, published from 1838 to 1839. We display an illustration by Phiz, Hablot Knight Brown, a regular illustrator of Dickens' works, entitled The Internal Economy of Dotheboys Hall, showing the wretched pupils of Wackford Squeers Yorkshire School being fed brimstone and treacle from a large communal spoon to purify them, but also because it will make them less inclined to eat breakfast and dinner. The school has little in the way of useful instruction, and its largely unwanted boys are beaten, starved and abused by the Squeers, who collect large fees for their schooling. Dickens based the school on the real-life notorious Yorkshire schools, which he visited prior to writing the book. He used a fictional depiction to call attention to the miserable conditions in these institutions and to call the deficiencies of the unregulated and to highlight the deficiencies of the unregulated and underfunded English education system. And his expose had some success, with Dickens' preface to the later edition of Nicholas Nickleby stating that the Yorkshire schools and schoolmasters he observed were almost a thing of the past. We include several pieces of campaign literature against child labour. One of the most famous is a memoir of Robert Blincoe. Blincoe was born in London and was an orphan of the St Pancras workhouse. He was initially employed as a chimney boy at age 6, before being sent with a group of other children to work in a cotton mill near Nottingham, then a different mill in Derbyshire in the first decade of the 19th century. The memoir relates to harsh conditions and treatment Robert and other children endured, working for long hours with little food, suffering cruel physical punishments and life-changing injuries. His biography was written by John Brown and published by the radical campaigner Richard Colley in his journal The Lion in 1832. It was subsequently published as a pamphlet and became an important piece of literature in the campaign against child labour and the investigations into conditions in mills and factories in the 1830s. Robert Blincoe's story may sound familiar. He has been called the real-life Oliver Twist. Like Robert, Oliver was born into the workhouse system, raised in a baby farm and workhouse before narrowly avoiding being apprenticed to a chimney sweep. However, although there are many similarities, the biography cannot be directly connected to Dickens or shown to have influenced his own work.
Thank you, Tansy. That concludes the exhibition tour. Thank you so much, everyone, for taking part. I hope you enjoyed it, and hand over to Bav.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much, Layla and Tansy, for that brilliant presentation. We're going to jump onto the Q&A part. So what I'm going to do is just share my screen once again with you. And hope this works. There we go. Okay, now we've got a bit of a special treat because in addition to Rebecca, Layla and Tansy, we are thrilled to be joined by Lucinda Dickens Hawksley, who is Charles Dickens's great granddaughter. I hope I've got that right. So Lucinda's also just now via chat agreed that she could join our Q&A part. So we're really glad that she's here. If you could unmute yourself as well, Lucinda, that would be brilliant. And Layla and Rebecca and Tanzi. So it's going to be with all four of you. I'm going to kickstart the questions, but please feel free to, type up your questions, and we'll get them read out in the next sort of 15-20 minutes. We'll try to finish this event around about 10 to, so that gives us about 15 minutes. I was really sort of taken aback by that sort of thing said right at the beginning. I think, Layla, you mentioned that the sort of, rather than publishing a pamphlet of information, Charles Dickens decided that, fiction would be a much more powerful tool to educate and to bring reform. I mean, this is really, it could be an exhibition in itself, really, isn't it? But what sort of items of the exhibition do you feel, or in your research, do you feel that this really had that impact?
I think what we found as we were researching was that those categories of fact and fiction are actually not as distinct as we had perhaps thought they would be. And we very much decided at the beginning that it would be showing Dickens's fictional works and showing some sympathetic works that were written by campaigners. But as we researched more about Dickens's own biography, and Lucinda obviously knows huge amounts more than I do about this, we realised how much of his childhood, particularly, he fed in to novels such as Oliver Twist. I mean, the character called Fagin, he met a boy called Bob Fagin when he was working in factories, a young boy. So even just names, very details were fed into his novels, and things he's seen on his walks around London. But at the same time that the campaigning writers were using elements of fiction to get their ideas across well, that they were maybe potentially not exactly creating characters, but creating amalgams of characters, because obviously they were trying to pull at people's heartstrings. They wanted funding. There was no state funding, so they had to get donations from the public. So therefore they often used to sort of exaggerate sometimes, or create composite characters. So I think what was really interesting about it was this merging of fact and fiction, but that very specific story of the Christmas Carol having part of its genesis in Dickens's horror at reading something that was going on in the world around him, and changing his mind and thinking this will have more power. I think the fact that we, at just the Christmas gone by, there was a redone version on television, just shows exactly how bright he was, that we were still at this, 150, well actually 200 years nearly away, thinking, yeah, we can relate some of that to contemporary society.
Yeah, totally. Things like street children, pickpocketing, criminals grooming young children, all these things are still very much prevalent in society today. And okay, child labor might not be something that's so obviously seen in the UK, but we know it happens around the world, and our purchasing of things supports that industry. So it's still very, very much relevant to things today. I've got a question that's come through from Mike. So he says he's interested to know that Senate House has this collection. How did it come about? How does it relate to the collection at Dickens House? And has the family still got artifacts? So a little bit about where these things have come from. Maybe whoever, Rebecca or Layla or Tanzi.
Shall I take that one? So the items on display are actually drawn from a number of our collections, our special collections principally. So for our first editions of Dickens, the very rare part works, those kind of things, they come from a collection called the Sterling Library, which specialises in first and fine editions of English literature. A lot of the campaigning work comes from one of our most important collections, the Goldsmiths Library, which has a huge collection of material, particularly from the 19th century, on living conditions, on labour conditions, on campaigns to improve these kind of situations and social conditions more generally. We also do on the Family Welfare Association Library, and that's an organisation which still exists today as Family Action. I think Becca will correct me if I got the name wrong for that one, but their collection built up under their original name, the Charity Organisation Society, in the 19th century, has a lot of ephemeral material on the kind of social work and welfare around not just children, but lots of other charitable endeavours. And it's interesting how, you know, some of that, I think Layla mentioned it in the section on street children, how we would look at it very differently today, some of that work. But the one of the interesting things from that collection was the admissions form to the Hospital for Sick Children, which became Great Ormond Street, which is a very ephemeral thing, but really shows the kind of the importance of that institution, not just to fee-paying patients, but to poorer children who could get access via charities as well. So it comes from all over our collections at the library, so not just one collection. We had the objects lent from the Dickens Museum. So really it's a collection of mainly print material that complements the museum collections there.
Can I just ask, how long did the, oh, sorry, Rebecca, yeah.
If I could just add to that briefly, Senate House Library has amazing collections that really are very strong on social justice or indeed injustice. And I think that's very much one of the drivers of what we choose in terms of the materials we pick for our exhibitions. So it's really good to have a look at what material we have, as Tansy and Layla have both shown. It's a collection of either, you know, physical books that we all know and love, or it's the really interesting things like that form for the Great Ormond Street, or it's the illustrations, and it's about telling that story visually and showing the range of material and which item really encapsulates the story we want to tell the best.
Just very quick thing, Rebecca, how long does it take to put an exhibition like this together? I mean, you know, from the very beginning of coming up with an idea, then reaching out to all those various collections and bringing it together, it just seems like it must have taken you years. But I mean, what's the process?
Well, I'd say start to finish is probably more like 6 months, and it's quite an intensive period to do that, obviously. And I think, as we've shown, there's just so many amazing items in Senate House Library that the tricky bit, and I'm sure Layla and Tansy will agree, that it's actually refining it to 80 items, which is roughly the amount of items we have in an exhibition. And we've got hundreds that we could use. So again, it's about telling that story. So we start with a theme, and we're looking at different anniversaries that come up. So with this one, obviously the 150th anniversary of Dickens' death was something we definitely wanted to celebrate because of his influence and also the material that we have in our collection. So it's really looking at the material we've got, what it says to people, what's the narrative, what can we learn from it? And I think you put it really well earlier, Bav, that, you know, these themes are still recurring, regretfully, and it's really about how we can learn from the past, how can we learn from the amazing Dickens himself in trying to really get these messages out there.
Lucinda, I'd love to just come on to you and talk a bit more about your great-great-great-grandfather. And tomorrow obviously is a milestone year, it's 150th anniversary of his death. What do you think is sort of the greatest legacy of Dickens? I mean, he's a celebrated hero of the UK. He's a great export of Great Britain all over the world. But in your opinion, what would you regard as his greatest legacy?
I think actually his social conscience, and the fact that we're still discussing this, the fact that this exhibition has been done, but also that people still refer to him when they're writing articles in newspapers about social injustice or poverty. They'll talk about Dickensian conditions. The name Dickens has just become, you know, a byword for, you know, bringing out the bad parts of society. And the fact that he chose, as Layla said, to write A Christmas Carol as opposed to the government report that he'd initially thought of doing. He totally understood that by storytelling, you can get that message across. And that's something that still resonates in so many of his books. And sadly, as Becca just said, it's still with us. I mean, it depresses me so much when I look at the news and think nothing has changed in the 150 years since he died, really. I mean, we think we're getting there and then we kind of slide back again. But I think that he's known all over the world is astonishing. Wherever I go in the world, people are talking about Dickens, reading Dickens. It never ceases to amaze me.
Yeah, no, it really is amazing. I mean, but it can't have been easy at the time when he was writing. So the criticism and the censorship and all of those things that he probably would have faced during his career when he was writing these works. Do we know anything about that? Is there any sort of knowledge about his experience of this at the time when he was writing, and whether he was really just fed up of trying hard, or was his work welcomed by society at that time?
His work really was, and actually it's quite interesting because a lot of politicians really disliked Dickens, but they knew that he was far more popular than they were. So they had to be quite careful. He was fairly untouchable by newspapers, which is quite interesting. So for example, famously, when he separated from his wife, and it was a very public legal separation, it's said that most of the newspaper editors actually knew that he was in a relationship with a young actress, but they wouldn't print it because people would have turned against the newspapers. They wouldn't have believed them. I'm sure that people like David Beckham are really envious of that today. But, you know, people really did, they did love Dickens, and he managed to transcend the social classes because he'd been born into the lower middle class, descended absolutely into the criminal classes when his father was imprisoned, and then he became a child labourer, and then he gradually moved his way up so that he was friends with aristocracy, Prince Albert, but he always remained friends with people who were social campaigners, who he was interested in, rather than who they were for snob fact. I mean, that's not to say he wasn't a snob, I'm sure he was as well, but he really liked people for their, for what they did, and the good that they did, and so he, you know, became very well connected. He's quite an extraordinary figure because it tends to be more of, we think of, quite an American thing to go through the social classes like that. It was very, very difficult in Britain in the 19th century to transcend those social classes. And the fact that he did and was read by the wealthiest and the poorest alike was really quite extraordinary. And that's how he managed to be so incredibly famous, because he just transcended all those barriers.
I think also
Fantastic.
What's really amazing about him was that he, the way he published, Lucinda, as well, about publishing parts of his stories in parts which were more affordable and therefore could reach a much wider audience than, say, buying a huge book at first off, which is going to cost a huge amount of money and makes it a much more exclusive artifact. So before the books were produced, you could buy the serializations, which people were hanging on cliffhangers waiting for the next part. And it's that
at its time, totally. Yeah. Everyone was waiting for the next installment, and that it's a bit like William Hogarth a century earlier. You know, he'd paint these beautiful paintings and then he'd engrave them and sell copies of the engravings, a bit like a poster being sold today. And that was how Hogarth managed to make his money, but also to make his name more widely known, because everybody, not quite everybody, but far more people could afford to have a picture hanging on their wall because they could afford an engraving, like they could afford, as Layla says, a magazine serial as opposed to a book.
Yeah,
book expensive, very expensive.
Yeah, I'm sure. Okay, we've got another question that's come from Basil Deeb. So what stood out for him was Dickens's decision to use fiction and storytelling to advocate political and social issues. Does the panel see this approach adopted by other writers, and how do you see this approach in our current social media dominated era?
I think it's used all the time. But I mean, I don't know what the others think of. Becca's nodding as well, so I'm going to give her a chance to speak. But you think particular, Rebecca?
Oh gosh, I mean, that's quite a question. I mean, we do see it in a variety of ways, and I think that's why we chose Dickens for this exhibition. He is really the perfect example of that. And obviously we've got different mediums now, and it's really interesting, as Layla and Tansy have shown, that, you know, Dickens was serialized and how that was published, and the whole history of the book and how we actually communicate is a really interesting element that we're obviously, a lot of us are experiencing, particularly at the moment, with different new ways of doing things and how we really communicate. So I would just say that, but it's quite a big question to tackle, really.
I think Dickens as well was less clumsy than some people about it. Tansy is one of the books in one of her sections that she researched was a social realist novel, which was really hardcore, but perhaps not as easy a read, and maybe ran into more trouble. I mean, Tansy can tell you which one that was. The way Dickens did it was a much more integrated. So you've got a fantastic story, and while you're getting engaged with all the characters, you suddenly realise you're getting all this other information. But Tansy, what was the other book?
So the only other actual fiction writer, I think the only other fiction writer we featured in the exhibition is Frances Trollope, whose most famous book was Michael Armstrong, The Factory Boy. And she published this just after Dickens started publishing Nicholas Nickleby. And what she was trying to do with the book was to address the issue of child labour in the late 1830s, which was a huge area of debate at the time, and the conditions in the mills of the North around this fictional version of Manchester. But she got huge amounts of criticism and abuse, some possibly stemming because she was a woman and she shouldn't be writing about these kind of things. A lot came from the fact that she also published in parts, and this was seen to be making the content more accessible. But her work obviously hasn't had the longevity that Dickens has, and that is probably partly to do with, frankly, the quality. But the book did become very famous for its illustrations, which I think if you can see them on the online version of the exhibition, you can see the most famous one of Michael and his brother. And those became very reused out of the context of the book as examples of child labour in the early 19th century, but they were very, she was accused of writing about something that she didn't really know, and misrepresenting it, and so lots of people were doing these social novels, these industrial novels at the time, but not quite as successfully as Dickens at the time.
The one that really springs to mind now, from everything Tansy was saying as well, and if you haven't read it, I urge you to. It's a few years old now, but by Benjamin Zephaniah, called Refugee Boy. Has anybody read it? Oh, it's just amazing, and it deals with, you know, the war between Ethiopia and Eritrea and what happens to refugee children within the British system, kind of care system. And it's a novel, but it's just fantastic. And I'd urge any children you know who are kind of 12, 13-year-old, buy it for them, because it's wonderful. But it's very similar in that it teaches you a huge amount about what's going on, really, while being a great story. And you think of someone like Matt Haig, what he's done recently in a lot of his social media work as well. Joanne Harris, not necessarily so much in her novels, but on social media, she's always really kind of, you know, calling out people for, you know, terrible behavior in government or whatever. So I think there's a load of writers who are still doing it. And it's, you know, on social media, everybody's a critic anyway, so everybody's got their chance to say what they want to say, which is sometimes good and sometimes not so good.
I think one of the things in the exhibition, his walking stick that we have on loan from Dickens Museum, his London night walks, you know, the fact that he very much lived the experience himself, obviously as a child, but obviously took great pains to go and actually see it for himself. I wonder what Dickens would make of Twitter and being able to see examples across the world. It's quite amusing to imagine Dickens on Twitter.
All the time, but he probably wouldn't get much writing done.
Someone did a project recently where they got people to take on the characters of Our Mutual Friend, and they all had to tweet as those characters, behaving as they would have done. So they had one character, Rogue Rider, who was a troll, and you know, it became like this. His book lent itself surprisingly well to being deconstructed via Twitter.
Brilliant. Well, look, on that note, I think we'll have to end the Q&A part. I'm going to just do a quick thank yous, but while I do that, Rebecca, could you just share the link of the exhibition website on the chat function so that people can explore this exhibition online? There's loads of resources there. It's actually really, really worth looking at. And there's a PDF of the sort of the booklet that accompanies the exhibition is excellent. So do download that and have a look at it. Very quick, just thank you all for attending, all of those who've stayed on. Sorry about the little technical thing in between, but we're glad we got through that really quickly. I want to thank Sonnet House Library for putting on this exhibition, and to the curators Leila Kassir and Tansy Barton for joining us today. A special thanks to Rebecca Simpson for her help in putting this event together. It's honestly really always a pleasure working with you, Rebecca, and we hope to do more of these exhibitions in future years.